Welcome to the CHCI Leadership Conference Breakout Session, Latinidad in 2021, Conversations on Identity, Rights, and Leadership. This session is made possible due to the gracious support of our sponsors, Procter & Gamble, Warner Media, Wells Fargo, and Univision Communications. Our panel chair, Representative Nanette Diaz-Barragan, will provide opening remarks. She is the first Latina ever to represent California's 44th Congressional District. We are also joined by Ron Estrada, Head of Government Relations and Senior Vice President of Corporate Social Responsibility for Univision Communications, Inc. Mr. Estrada is also Vice Chair of the Board for the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute. Our moderator for today's session is Nancy Lopez, Professor of Sociology at the University of New Mexico and co-founder and director of the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice. Please welcome Representative Nanette Diaz-Barragan.
Good afternoon. My name is Nanette Diaz-Barragan, and I am proud to represent the 44th Congressional District of California. I am the first Latina to represent this district, and I now have the distinct pleasure of serving as the first vice chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. I was born in Harbor City, California, the youngest of 11 children. I was raised by my immigrant parents from Mexico, who not only instilled a strong work ethic in me and my siblings, but also encouraged us to think big. My dream has always been to give back to my community with the hope of making people's lives better. Working at various levels of government has allowed me to live that dream and help not only my constituents in the 44th District, but also my fellow Americans. A good example of why I decided to run for elected office is the issue of environmental justice. I have witnessed firsthand in my district the environmental disparities from pollution that communities of color and low-income communities face on a daily basis. The decades-old legacy of racism and environmental inequity have made these communities particularly vulnerable. I have introduced several major pieces of legislation during this session of Congress, including H.R. 2442, the Climate Justice Grants Act, which supports community-led clean energy and climate resiliency projects through grants to environmental justice communities. I am so pleased that CHCI asked me to host this discussion today on Latinidad in 2021, Conversations on Identity, Rights, and Leadership. When we talk about the various attributes shared by Latin American people, identity, rights, and leadership are key attributes that are particularly relevant given the heightened scrutiny this nation is placing on social justice issues. The focus on social justice issues is making us look at ourselves more closely than ever before. As a community, as a culture, we are working to understand how we deal with issues such as race, immigration, and social class. It is imperative that we work to understand these things about ourselves. The better we are at understanding ourselves, the better we will be at building and utilizing political power. I'm looking forward to hearing from our panel on this very important topic. On behalf of CHCI, I want to thank the panel for sharing their insights and experiences. I also want to thank everyone in our audience for coming today. Thank you.
Welcome. It is an honor to reconvene this afternoon alongside an esteemed group of individuals. Marco Davis, President and CEO of CHCI, is a great example of what it takes to promote and strengthen community. And this gathering is pivotal in bringing us together in unity and fostering important dialogue crucial to our community. Univision Communications is especially pleased to support CHCI, not because I'm the vice chair of the board of directors, rather, we are both mission-driven organizations striving to serve the Latino community. Our overarching company empowerment initiatives focuses on resources for transformational change in health, education, civic participation, and DE&I. During Hispanic Heritage Month, we will launch a new campaign that will live across our multiple platforms called Unidos Somos Uno. Together we are one. The goal of this campaign will be restoring and increasing social equality while facilitating equal representation regardless of gender, race, or class. Last year, as part of Univision's Voto Conmigo, the campaign featured profiled stories of 4 individuals with previous criminal records, voting for the first time after restoring their rights. In addition, a town hall series was launched called The Time Is Now, Understanding and Confronting Racial Injustice. It focused on police reform and created content on LGBTQ rights. We believe that it is the efforts of everyone watching and listening at this moment, moving forward together in fraternity and solidarity, collaborating generously, that allows us to continue to significantly impact the lives of Latinos. So on behalf of the Univision family, I thank you all for working each day to advance our community.
Saludos familia, greetings family. My name is Dr. Nancy Lopez. My pronouns are she, her, and ella. I'm co-founder and director of the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice. I'm also professor of sociology at the University of New Mexico. I'm honored to be here today to help lead this important discussion on Latinidad and what that means in 2021 for the future of our community, and talk to you about such important topics as identity, rights, leadership, for practicing solidarity and advancing equity for all of our communities. I want to give a special thanks to Congresswoman Nanette Diaz-Barragan for her opening remarks and for setting a great tone for our conversation on the importance of understanding ourselves. I also want to extend a warm thanks to Ron Estrada of Univision Communications for his welcome and his emphasis on leadership for transformation. And thank you to the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute for hosting this thoughtful leadership conference and for focusing on the important topic of Latino identity for advocacy. Please feel free to tweet your comments about this session at hashtag CHCIHHM21. This is really an invitation to each of you to engage in reflection and action, and thinking deeply about what it means to practice solidarity and how important it is to think about identity. And not only our narratives of identity, but also what is our social location and grids of power, and how do we advance equity? What are our ethical and political commitments? I'm delighted to be joined by 4 experts on this topic. First, help me welcome Lisbeth Melendez Rivera of BQN Counseling. Lisbeth is a 30-year plus veteran of the LGBTQ and labor movements. She has extensive experience organizing and training at the intersections of sexual orientation, gender identity, and culture, specifically as they relate to communities of culture. Communities of color.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Now let's welcome Marina Mazzini. She is the Senior Vice President of Finance for Global FemCare at Procter & Gamble.
Hi, thank you for having me as well. Looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Ruben Barrelas. He is Senior Vice President for External Engagement at Wells Fargo. As part of Diverse Segments Representation and Inclusion organization, he's responsible for advancing Wells Fargo's diversity and inclusion goals, policy priorities, and reputation.
Hi, Nancy. Thank you. Fantastic to be here with you and the panelists and all the participants at CHCI for this session. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce Diana Mulagon. She's an innovator in engaging cross-cultural tastemaker audiences as Senior Vice President and General Manager of Stage 13, a 6-time Emmy Award-nominated original content studio and part of Warner Brothers Television Group.
Hi, Nancy. Thank you. It's a pleasure being here. Can't wait to have a great conversation with you and the panelists and all of the folks that are watching today.
Thank you for being here. Welcome, panel, and thank you all for joining us. I'm really looking forward to this conversation as it has many implications for the future of our community. And participants, welcome. We'd love to see what questions you have for panelists. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat box at any time. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in with my first question. And it's really about getting us to think about how our own identities shape the kind of work that we do. So I'll start by sharing my own identity and the kind of work that I do in higher ed for the last 27 years or so. So I am a Black Latina, US-born Dominican woman raised in New York City. My parents never had the opportunity to have formal education. They have a second grade education. But all the knowledge and wealth of knowledge that they imparted on all of my siblings and I, there were 5 of us, really comes from that cultural wealth, right? And that resistance to systems of oppression that they taught us from a very long time ago. They basically told us, no dejes que nadie te robe tu derecho. Don't let anyone rob you of your rights. And that really kept us going through very rough times. I grew up in public housing. I attended de facto public high schools in New York City. And that really shapes the kind of research that I do, the kind of teaching that I do, the kind of leadership that I do. I've been here at the University of New Mexico for the last 20 years. I have served on 75 PhD and MA committees. I'm very committed to creating the next generation of knowledge producers. And I'm also very interested in transforming curriculum, hiring. So I created an Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice. So just to give you a snapshot of how I reflect on my social location and systems of inequality and how I use whatever circle of influence I have to advance equity for our communities. And I'd love to invite Diana to kind of share her identity and also your domain of work and how you advance equity.
Wow, that is so inspirational, Nancy. First of all, I love everything you talked about, your identity. My pronouns are she, ella, her. I am a first generation Latina, born in the U.S., but grew up both in Latin America and in the U.S. Single mom, working class family, nothing to do with the entertainment industry. So, of course, being an outsider into this industry, and very much, first want to go to college. Immigrant experience, bilingual, bicultural, an only child. So I knew the power of, continuing generationally, that power of education, which my very matriarchal family instilled in me, education, and persevere. And for me, having, when I did come back to the US and grew up in Los Angeles, it became very clear that there was an opportunity in terms of representation. Again, I had a chance to go sort of into the system as an infiltrator and create change from within, understanding as a consumer of media and pop culture, realizing that I wasn't seeing my image reflected, my Latinidad. There weren't any images of that really that were really relevant. And so for me to have a chance to go on the inside and say, how can I make change? What do I need to do? Educate myself. And that's been sort of my mission from the get-go, many moons ago, more than 20 years ago when I started in the industry, to really understand, first of all, how it all was sort of wired and where the points of impact could be. And currently in my role at Warner Brothers and Warner Television, I have an amazing team of colleagues in terms of the diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as on the programming side of actual television and film content, that we are out there literally day by day, understanding how do we cultivate the next generation of storytellers behind the camera, in front of the camera, from all angles, so we can challenge the status quo and really create those opportunities to create intersectional storytelling and really make sure that when it comes to Latinos, all dimensions of Latinos are represented, not just one.
That is beautiful. Thank you for sharing that story, Diana. And now I'd like to invite Marina to share her story.
Yes, awesome. That was so inspiring, Diana, as well. So I'm originally from Argentina, actually been living in US for only 11 years. So I grew up in a family, what I would say low class family. I'm the first generation of college. Actually, I came 10 years ago with basic English. Probably some of you might say my English is still basic right now. But, so I learned my way through. And I have a thick accent, right, coming from. And I actually grew up in a family where my mom was a stay-at-home mom, actually sewing my clothes because we didn't have the money to go and buy for clothes. And my dad would do night shifts so that we could earn the money and live the day to day. So, and during that, my education as well, I think the other important thing about me is I learned like in my culture was very male dominant as well. So where the women would stay at home and do the households at home. And if I were to have kids, then that was my destiny probably. So I never envisioned myself where I am right now. I'm currently the Vice President of Finance for Global Femcare, so I manage the Tampax and Always brand that are very inspiring brands as well for women, for Hispanics. And I have 4 kids, so I have a 14-year-old, 12-year-old, 9-year-old, and 7-year-old. So learning to like manage my 4 kids, my cultural background, being in US, learning the English and all that. So I believe inside P&G, at least, they gave me a huge opportunity. I've been working more than 20 years in P&G, and they helped me to grow, right? And so I feel that I owe a lot to the people that are coming behind me and to the society, to the community and all that. So that's why how I think about my work is actually on my day-to-day. I do a lot of finance strategy and all that, but a lot of my time goes into giving back to 4 pillars that I work with inside P&G. Is the first one is the employees, how we can retain, how we can recruit them, how we can develop them, remove any barriers that they have. The second one is on the brands. Specifically, I work on Tampax and Always, right? And how we can be a voice there for the Hispanic community, for the girls and all that. The next one is partners, like getting the representation through with the people that we do business and our suppliers and all that, so that we make sure that we have the representation there. And the last one is on the community and the impact and giving back, donating products, donating our hours for education, and we have some partnerships there. So I feel a huge sense of I owe a lot based on what I receive as well, and that's what inspires me and guides me into my journey.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Marina. Very inspirational. Ruben, would you like to chime in?
Sure, Nat. Well, I love hearing these stories, and there's so much intersection and commonality, and at the same time, a lot of differences. My story is I'm soy hijo de padres mexicanos. So my parents came to this country. I was born in California, and was the first in my family to go to college. I mean, I didn't really know anyone who had gone to college or had a professional career. We were construction. My mom cleaned houses. I mean, we were one of the few Spanish-speaking families initially in our neighborhood. For me, it was kind of, being different than the majority population was always kind of as a young kid growing up was made an impact. So I was always looking for camaraderie, always looking for connection with fellow Latinos as well. I got involved very much in community, nonprofits. I ran for public office and was the first Latino elected in my community on the Board of Supervisors in California. And then I went on to do more work in politics with a focus on identifying and bringing up Latinos and Latinas who could help serve their communities. And currently with Wells Fargo, and I am working in our new group, which is enterprise-wide, focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we really approach it from, much like Marina was talking about, primary audience are employees, and identifying Latino and Latinas who we want to help to elevate, to support them and help them in their career to move forward. And to me, that's really exciting, is identifying young Latino, Latina talent and helping them really become the decision makers, the leaders of the future.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's really powerful. And Lisbeth, would you like to share your story?
Sure. So my name again is Lisbeth Melendez Rivera. For many of you, um, might think that my middle name is Melendez. My actual full last name is Melendez Rivera, and I specifically say that because I am not the corporate person on this panel. I'm actually the troublemaker in this panel. I started troublemaking when I was 14 and protested the presence of the Navy in the island of Vieques, which they had overtaken. My background is from a mixed race, mixed class background. I grew up in Puerto Rico. Um, it is the place where every time somebody says, "Are you going home?" and people might mean Washington D.C., and I immediately think like, "No, I'm actually not taking a plane yet because Puerto Rico will always be home for me." I also come from a family of 17 in the immediate background, 17 teachers. Education has been the cornerstone of my mother's side of the family, while my father's side of the family has dabbled in business. I've always said that I would do neither business nor education. I am now a trainer who's a PhD, actually a doctoral in ministry candidate. And I own my own consultant firm. So go figure, I ended up doing both of those things. What that means in general for me, in terms of this subject around equity and representation, is that I am the person who walks into the room and calls you on it, calls, helps you figure out the ways in which we can do this in ways in which are respectful. They're not tokenizing, in ways in which it shows people behind, those who follows, who are ahead of us and who follow us, that it is possible to fully enter into a room as everything that you are. And for the record, my pronouns are she, ella. I use she in English, ella in Spanish, which is the neutral. I am, in for most intents and purposes, and I understand for some people this will turn some heads, but my full identity is as a Latina butch dyke. I'm somebody who is gender non-conforming, who happens to be a woman who loves women and who holds her Latinidad so close to my heart that I know I can recognize another Boricua in the middle of a blizzard in the city of Boston under 10 inches of snow, and I will look at them and say, "Wepa!" Because we're here. We're here to be heard. We're here to be represented. And that's where I spend my professional time. And that's where I actually have fun too. So it was amazing when I found out I could make money out of that too, just so I could pay the rent and have a roof over my head.
Thank you, Lisbeth. That is just incredible. First of all of your stories are inspiring me. I am just so grateful to each of you for your work. And the next set of questions, I think I want to share a quote from two of my favorite sociologists, both Latinas, Maxine Bacazin, who is Chicana, and Ruth Zambrana, who is Puerto Riqueña, right? Like raised like me, parents with a second grade education in New York City, etc. Clara Rodriguez actually was the first U.S.-born Puerto Rican sociologist that inspired me to do the work that I do. So I'll just share this quote and then have you reflect on the questions that I have here. It says, and this is from Bacazin and Zambrana, we caution that Latino-Latina as a social construct must be problematized. It's complicated by differences in national origin, citizenship, race, class, ethnicity, and by the confluence of all these factors. An intersectional approach acknowledges these differences and seeks to reveal how they shape experience. When we use the term Latinas, it's not as a unitary term that homogenizes distinctive groups. And this is the most important part for me. They say it's a term of implicit solidarity with other U.S. groups with a Spanish colonial history, genealogical, political, cultural, and ethnic ties to Latin America. And to me, that's basically what this panel is. It is about recognizing our differences, our intersectional differences, race, gender, class, sexual orientation, citizenship status, etc., and then shifting to understand other Latinos who might have a different experience. And how do we practice solidarity so we advance equity? So these next set of questions are recognizing that and saying, how do you apply intersectionality? How do you even define it, not only in the work that you do, the outreach, but your data collection, your distribution of resources. And for instance, thinking about class differences, I think most of us talked about coming from a class background, like in my case, parents were, factory workers, but also having this rich cultural wealth. How do we capture our efforts in terms of looking at race? And I use the term street race to refer to the idea that race is not simply about how you identify, but also how others see you when you go seek a mortgage or enter an emergency room or are walking down the street. So how do we account for that multidimensional facet of identity that's not simply your narrative, but it's also about how you're seen and perceived by others and how that shapes your access to resources, and also what your ethical and political commitments are. For instance, you can be a street race white Latina who is absolutely about equity and inclusion and practicing what you preach, and you could be a street race brown, black, or even Asian Latino who is not about that. So just recognizing there is a distinction, right? That your identity could be multifaceted, and what you do with that identity can look very different. So if anyone would like to start us off in thinking about intersectionality, how is that part of your everyday work? How do you define it? And how do you practice what you preach?
So for me, I mean, I grew up with that intersectionality. I mean, I'm very fair skinned. I think my street, what do you call it, street race is white. I'm very much Latino. I did have my DNA done, which, 60% Iberian Peninsula and then 30% Mexican indigenous. So as I say, that's 100% Mexican, right? I've grown up with family and friends and community much darker than myself, and for me it's something I've always been conscious of, but always helped me appreciate the diversity within the Latino community. So wherever I go throughout the country, and I make a point of going into Latino communities that may or may not be Mexican, maybe other Latino communities, and understanding that there are a lot of differences, but there's a lot of intersectionality. I mean, I feel at home when I'm in a Puerto Rican community, a Cuban community, in other parts of the country, for example, or Central American.
One of the things that I would add here is that I have spent a significant amount of my time not doing work in whiteness, but doing work in intra Latinx and ethnicities and communities of color in general, right? So Black, Indigenous people, racialized minorities in this country, who unfortunately internalize the wedge issues and don't allow us to really work into that intersectionality. So what does it mean for us to engage in the difficult conversation of what you said, Nancy, around you could be, your street race could be Black, and you've internalized it in such a way that you don't talk about it, you don't see yourself in that mirror. And so what does that look like for us to be able to succeed, to advance, to live a world where I, as a social justice warrior, work myself out of a job? Because my dream is to get up one morning when I said my job is no longer needed. Equity and inclusion are things that are no longer needed because we've achieved a particular way. And and it might be Pollyannic of me to think that way, but if I don't do that, then what motivation do I have to wake up in the morning if I think everything is going to be as messed up always as it is today? Or so that idea that you have to have the difficult conversations, that you have to be open to find the common point in a sea of difference in order for us to be able to work through it, even when we might disagree in some of the points, is how I approach my work to intersectionality. When I walk into the room, I don't make a decision if I am walking in as a woman. I don't make a decision if I'm walking in as a lesbian. I don't make a decision if I'm working as a Latina, as a mixed race individual, as somebody whose background, whose family was assimilated from Judaism because, white settled Christianity like erased all of who I was and all of who I brought to this country. I walk in with all of those things, and then I look for those who share at least one of those and engage in the conversations necessary to do the hard work, to do the work of change. And equity will never come unless we're able to do that, in my personal view. And that's how I engage with it.
That's very,
So
very
Nancy,
relevant. I'm sorry, Marina, go ahead.
well, so what I was going to add is how I try to approach it is I try to bring my full self to work, to the community, and that's try to role model with the people, because of that I came and live in US. I have this thing that I wanted to assimilate and look like someone else that I was not in, right? So I try to live like with, this is me. This is the things that work for me. This is the things that don't work for me. And so that people then see that it's okay to bring your full self to work. And that's how we all become better as well. And so a lot has been on role modeling, is bringing up my story, sharing what I went through and what others go through, and then don't doing these assumptions that because I grew up like I grew up or I have this problem, someone is going through the same, right? Because of people having complete different backgrounds. So trying to like role model and be open to Lisbeth's point is like just speak up, right? Like leaving that room for people to be themselves. That's, I think, what's make us better, and that's what actually I enjoy. And so
Yeah.
Well, for us in our world, sort of in the entertainment industry, it's sort of you're fighting a battle on many fronts, but two very specific ones. So it's sort of twofold. One is in the stories and the storytellers, and making sure that we have such a wide canvas of identifying those storytellers from around the world and making sure that they have the access and the opportunity to really make their way into this, legacy business that's over 100 years old. So there's that notion of how do you make sure those intersectional points of view, those intersectional storytellers have a pathway, and there's a whole host of us in the industry trying to make sure we're doing that on many fronts. The other piece of it is in terms of the actual executives and folks that work in the industry. So there are very few Latino executives in the industry, and that is bad news. And there's a lot of work to be done, and there's work being done on all fronts, on studios, on the network side. So the fact that we have to make sure, to your point, Marina, of bringing your full self and how we walk into the room. So Lisbeth's point, we have to make sure the rooms have the right makeup of the right folks making those decisions, having those conversations, and really looking at all angles of what has been done, what hasn't been done. Because in this case, in the intersectional work that we do, there's a lot of work to be done still, as we can tell, just looking at the Emmys even, the other night. So I think there's work to be done. Intersectional has to be sort of a day in, day out battle that we're doing on many fronts.
I think that's a real important point, is that for a lot of this, what Elizabeth has talked about, Diana, we need more of us in those rooms at the table. If we're going, to make the decisions, to vote on, the awards, to decide who gets promoted, to actually identify who's out there that might, even be talent. We need to be at the table. To me, that is really fundamental for what we need to do.
And make the commitment that if we're the one person to walk into the room, that we leave two behind.
Mm-hmm.
For me, that has always been the commitment. If I'm the only one in that room, by the time I leave, if I'm on a board, if I'm on a voting committee, there will be at least two of me. Period. And I will stay until I can get those two people.
Can they handle two of you?
I hope so. Yeah. I hope so.
So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit and talk about data. How do we create equity metrics that are intersectional? And I'll start off with another quote from two other amazing sociologists, Patricia Hill Collins and Surma Bilge. And it's about defining intersectionality. When it comes to social inequality, people's lives in the organization of power in a given context are better understood as not being shaped by a single axis of social division, be it race or gender or class, but by many axes that work together and influence each other. People use intersectionality as an analytic tool for solving problems that they and others around them face. So this next question is really asking about what your data practices, wherever your domain is, right? How do you create a data infrastructure that creates metrics that allow for intersectional analysis? And so the question is, how do you assist small businesses being impacted at a greater rate than white counterparts? How do you collect data that doesn't bias the process? How do we know that we're reaching the communities that we want to reach? And I'll just share that I've been doing a lot of work on trying to think about ways that we can include intersectionality in the Office of Management and Budget reporting that happens, the guidelines, and also the census. The current gaps in data collection has led some academics and even some civil rights organizations to believe that it would be better to include Hispanic as a separate racial category in all of our official data collection than collecting it as a separate question, Hispanic origin and race. Despite best intentions, this approach, I believe, is flawed. It's not based on the preponderance of scientific social science evidence that shows that these are two different measures, that we need them separate so that we can understand how my cousins who on my father's side are all very fair skinned. Many of them are blonde and blue eyed. And in fact, when we were growing up in the Lower East Side, some people would speak Yiddish to them because they just assumed that they were whites or Eastern European immigrants. And everyone on my mother's side who's very dark skinned, Afro Latino, black, and everyone would speak English to them because they assumed. And let's just say that you can predict just from the social science evidence who lives in what neighborhoods and what the treatment is, right, in terms of the color line. So how do we make our equity metrics for whatever organization? I'm in higher ed, some are in advocacy as Elizabeth, and then others are in corporate settings. How do we make them intersectional? How do we walk and chew gum at the same time so that we are collecting ethnicity separate from race as a master social status, and looking at class, and looking at gender and sexual orientation and all of those? So if you could just share some strategies that you might consider or use for equity metrics.
Well, I'll just say really quickly. Oh, go ahead, Ruben.
No, Diana, go ahead.
No, I was going to say really quick, we have our diversity, equity, and inclusion team over the last couple of years has put together this annual diversity report, and really it puts everything in black and white and in color, but it really puts it out there in terms of the metrics, and some of it is hard to see, I think, for some folks in the company, but it's important to look at it in all its dimensions and in all its breaks that you have to look at, because you don't value what you don't measure. So understanding what the benchmarks are, where we're at today, how we can move the needle in certain places. And I would have to say on the other side, data is critical, because it really is, when it comes to the audiences and consumers that touch all of our industries, it's all in our favor. We're talking about a multiracial nation, as we're seeing from the census figures. We're talking about the most influential, segments of the audience are all represented by Latinos, and the most powerful, audience populations and segments. So I feel like the data's on our side on that end of it. Now we have to make sure that we're educating, working with our cohorts to measure everything we're doing in every level, so that we know if we're moving the needle or not. And numbers don't lie at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're definitely taking data in terms of, I mentioned, primary audience of our own employees, and really not only using the data, well, not only gathering the data, but using it in terms of figuring out our performance measures for managers. And we're disaggregating data, not just diversity, but into different segments. So you parse that intersectionality, if you will, so see how we're actually doing. And as it relates to our customers and the communities that we serve, it's a mixed bag, Nancy, as you're referring to. There are some data we can't collect. It's not legal for us to collect certain data. And then in other areas it is, and we'll take some of that data that we're able to collect, and we'll meet with some of the large national advocacy groups and show them what we're doing, how we're doing it, and try to get their input in terms of how better to serve the community. And finally, in terms of, say, serving the community, providing resources, access to capital to diverse communities, Latino communities, we're using surrogates, if you will, in the communities, the CDFIs, the minority depository institutions, the nonprofits who can provide technical assistance and capital to, in this case, Latino-owned businesses.
Great. And I would say that for those of us who do advocacy work and consult around DEI issues, for me a major assessment tool is both a vertical and a horizontal survey of how organizations look like, and how organizations you want them to look like after the end of the process, right? I think that both planning process and outcome evaluations are incredibly important, and surveys serve us well around that. And when I refer to that, and I think Diana, you talked about this, is we have incredibly diverse diverse industries in this country across the board, from the nonprofit sector to corporate. The problem is, where does the diversity lie and remains? And that's why vertical surveys are so important. We want to see where Latinos are placed within that. There's not that there's no Latinos in the entertainment industry or in Wells Fargo or Procter and Gamble. It's, where are they? Are they in management? Are they in the vice presidency? Or are they all in the middle management and lower categories? So that's your vertical assessment. And then horizontally, which of those, which department is considered to be the most prestigious? And is that department the one that holds all of one type of people versus a department that is not the one that people want to be at? And that is where we are pigeonholed. And so even if we're all secretaries, even if we're all vice presidents, where are we placed in the larger context and map? What is the social contracts of that organization in its nature? And so that's one of the ways in which I agree. I study data in order for me to be able to create the plans that are necessary. And then you go into process evaluation and you figure out, as you're implementing those changes, where are those changes happening and moving? And hopefully with outcome evaluation, you'll see significant changes that allow us to do that.
Right on. That sounds absolutely right.
Yeah, and that's I was going to echo, and that's to the topics I was talking before, right? On the representation, on the recruiting, each level going through the data and understanding then the why, what's going on, what happens. So it's not just the data per se, but then the second level, and we are looking into our representation, as you were calling, across each level. And where are the gaps? And what are the interventions that we need to do? And what are the targets? In which scorecard, or who is going to be accountable? So taking it all the way through, then accountability of our leaders progressing, that's what makes a difference as well.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and take questions from the audience. I see a few that have come in, but before I do, I just wanted to mention one way I do it here in higher ed is by contextualizing, right? So in looking at 9 years of graduation data, I looked at 20 social locations, low income, Latina women versus high income, and I found major differences that would remain invisible if we just said, oh, I'm just going to report on Latinas, or I'm just going to report on the high income. But if you actually look at odds of graduating by those social locations, you make visible some things. So I also want to address Ruben's question about some data that might be illegal to collect. Actually, we can collect a lot of data as long as we aggregate them up to the OMB standards, the Office of Management and Budget. So for instance, here in New Mexico, there's not that many Dominicanos, right? But there's plenty of Mexicanos, right? My husband is Chicano from northern New Mexico, no immigrant roots, but has a deep history here, right? And so it would be interesting to see, are we seeing differences in terms of graduation by, all these groups? So we have a lot of wiggle room as long as we aggregate, up until the bigger categories. So the question that came in is one that I have been thinking about for a very long time. I started off by saying I'm a Black Latina. And the question is, how can Latinos be better allies to the Black community in fighting for racial justice? And I want to quote the late Miriam Jimenez Roman, who with her late husband also wrote Juan Flores, the Afro-Latino Reader. And this is a beautiful quote. It says, "We have to trouble the myth that Latinidad and Blackness are mutually exclusive, and to recognize their interface, right, in the Afro-Latino presence. Afro-Latinos have been invisible and erased, from either the Black or the Latino population as far as the mainstream media is concerned. We're kind of talked about as if though we're mutually exclusive. So how do we change that conversation, right? And the same is true for Indigenous Latinos, for even Asian Latinos. I've gone to a lot of retreats and summits on racial equity within the Latino community, and I've had people.
And
I think we lost you. So I think I can go and try to answer the question, although we lost you. So I believe that we have a responsibility to create a world where we can all succeed. You're Black, you're Asian, you're it's a name, right? And that's why how I do it in my day in and my day out is I value the person for the person itself, right? And then I can like extend my hand and share my story. I was actually a couple of weeks ago talking about Afro-American women inside PNG and some barriers that they were having. And I was sharing my stories or things that I have found working with a Hispanic community that then we can reapply to the stories that they were sharing with me. So I think we have a role to play to help like every single person that's outside. So I try to, going back to the theme that I was talking before, extending the hand and the role that we have to play. So I like, Elizabeth, if when I leave, I want to see two people, I generally here inside PNG, I want to extend my hand and pull as many people I can with me, right? And that's what legacy here and working through that.
That's great. Yeah.
And I will, one of the things that I will say is, and this is something that we do not get ourselves called into, and it's our willingness to step aside. When I say when I leave, is because I've realized that the need to have somebody who looks like me is no, it's it takes away from the opportunity of somebody else who doesn't to do the work and to have the representation. And it to me is so important that as a mixed race person, that if that for my Afro Latinx siblings, that if it is more important they're in that room and that voice is heard, and that I stay there to support that voice, that's great. But if there can be two Afro Latinx people who can speak about an experience that is very different than mine, that will help us achieve and deconstruct that false narrative that we are two separate identities. Because the reality is that, let's face it, like we talk about slavery in this country, but every single one of our countries had a form of that. As a matter of fact, Brazil still suffers from from a lot of the struggles around what slavery did in their country. And in Portugal was the number one exporter until the Dutch took over 200 years later. And so there's historical points that we have to understand here, that the origins of Latinidad come from the oppression of indigenous and black individuals, either by by the illegal trafficking of their lives, or by their simply erasure and genocide of the peoples who were already here in order to please the power of others. And if we can begin our narratives with that and bring people into those conversations, it is the beginning then of us deconstructing that false narrative that Nancy so well was speaking about. We are not separate identities. We are one and the same, and some of us are representative, more visually representative than others. And that visual representation, because of the nature of racism, cannot be ignored, no matter what ethnicity, no matter what race, no matter what circumstances you're talking about. We must understand the importance of not prejudice, not xenophobia, but racism as it refers to the power of white settled colonialism in our lives in general.
That's a great point. I'm going to jump in since Nancy's not here and with the next question. And the next question is, does having so many terms for Latino ID, such as Latino, Latinx, divide us, or should we embrace new ways to identify?
Can I say something? Yeah, I'm going to jump on this one because I have a couple of things to say about it, but I'll keep it brief. Why are we so damn bought into la Real Academia de la Lengua Española, que es un chorro de hombres que no hacen una pendejada y no cambian, right? Like, these are people who will not change no matter what. It is a male-dominated institution that rules a language that does not allow it to grow. The terms of Latina, Latino, Latino arroba, Latinx, Latine allow us to embrace our identities and to grow a language that by its own formation was the language of the peasants. And for them to codify it in a way and to use it, which is a colonial language to begin with, never mind, the whole oppression around, like, what does it mean for us to include indigenous words into this? the fact that that Spanish is in itself a male-dominated language should be something that we, as Latine people, need to look deeply into. Don't tell me that the Royal Academy says that the real way to speak is in the masculine. I'm sorry. The answer is no. It is not the only way. It has never been the only way, and it will never be the only way. So we should get together and challenge the Royal Academy versus fighting amongst ourselves as to what do we believe the oppressor is telling us the right way to speak is. So I'll stop there because I can speak for hours on this subject.
Yeah.
Please, Beth, thank you. And I apologize. I don't know what happened. I didn't lose internet service, but somehow the portal wasn't working for me. So what I wanted to do was think a little bit about what your next projects are. What are the ways in which you are advancing issues of identity, leadership, and equity? What are different priorities? If you had a wish list, what would that look like 20 years from now? How would you even know that you've been successful in implementing these projects?
For me, it goes back to Elizabeth. Elizabeth works her way out of a job. I think at large corporations, you see more Latinos and Latinas in higher positions. To me, that really is the marker. That horizontal. I know the vertical. I know the horizontal is important, but the vertical really want to push our people up that ladder.
Yeah, and for me, it's what you were calling Ruben. Plus, also for us is having even people that we do business with, right? Our partners, having more representation there on Hispanics, or helping even more the communities as well, and seeing that a lot of progress on education as well. So those are kind of metrics that I would hope, like in 20 years, we are not talking about this, like all these differences that I'm currently seeing.
Well, and I would say on a broad strokes to Nancy's question is that Latinos in Latinidad is recognized in its not being a silent majority, but sort of the powerful majority that it is. I feel like we're always undervalued and underestimated, and we need to make sure that we are at the forefront and we're driving the change and we're influencing, and really the game-changing influence that we have is recognized the way it should.
Anyone else want to add? How would you know that we've been successful? For me, I'll answer the question. When I earned my doctorate in 1999, Latinos were like 3% of PhDs awarded, 3% of the credentialed knowledge producers in academia. And now it might have doubled. Maybe we're at 5 or 6%. That's inadequate. I hope and pray that that's not the case in 20 years, right? That cannot be. And I think you're all familiar with the research that has shown that high school ethnic studies courses in the 9th grade, and this is by some of my colleagues in California, dramatically impact inequalities, right? Reduce inequalities for all students, but particularly those that have historically not been underserved. So I would love to see curricular changes, not only in higher ed, but also in K-12, et cetera. So that's when we've written myself out of this job, right? Where I can sit back and say, no, it's not 3 or 5%. And, of the credentialed knowledge producers that also look like me, that came from first-gen families, as many of us did, and that are immigrant or undocumented, et cetera. All of those things matter to me. So I think now I'd love to invite any last remarks. What message do you want, if you had to give a soundbite, about what issues we should be thinking about as the Latino community, as this beautiful family that we're a part of, that I'm so happy to be a part of? What message would soundbite? What remarks would you like to share? What is your message on issues of identity, leadership, and rights and solidarity for the Latino community for the next, generation? What will be your legacy? Whoever wants to start.
Well, I'll jump in, and I think what all of us touched on is we have to help bring each other up. I think that, be dedicated to doing that consciously. Elizabeth's rule of leave, bring 2 more on. I think that's going to help make a difference. We demographically, in terms of the numbers, there's no stopping the Latino community in the U.S. The only thing that's stopping us is not helping one another succeed. And to raise whatever industry, whatever endeavors that we're taking on is helping each other move forward.
For me, it's a matter of courage and fearlessness. because there is so much work that continues that has to be done, and is going to continue. The element of knowing that it's sort of a hard road ahead, but that at the same time it's aspirational and inspirational to know that we can do this, that we have made some progress. But when you hear, Nancy, 3%, 5%, that's what inspires, but also gets you angry and makes you want to have that courage to go out and lead and say, we have to figure this out. We're not going to take no for an answer. We're not going to hear the excuses anymore. We're going to get the work done. So for me, that's what it is, to all our respective industries, and however our touch points are, is to work with allies or do the work ourselves together, and progress, move forward.
Yes, for me, the two thoughts that come to mind is what I was saying. The first one is pull forward people, and the second one is the role that each of us play. You don't have to be a Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, or however to be called to make a difference here. So we need to enroll like other people that can help us, and we need to be able to help the other communities as well. So take it personal and make the difference would be like my two comments probably.
Gracias. Thank you.
I I think about this question a lot because we sit here as educated individuals who have had the privilege of receiving a college education, however we came to it, and have succeeded in our fields. And we measure that by the letters after our name, by, so success can be measured in many ways. Latinidad should not be the thing that stops you from owning the best car shop ever, to be the best master electrician, which, by the way, requires a lot of damn math. Just want to be clear. Like, people, it's like, and it's like, not all of us are cut to have PhDs, and that is perfectly okay. What I see and what I instill in my nibblings, right, my nieces and nephews and in between, is that whatever you set out to be the best you can and represent Latinidad with everything that you got. Because when we take a look at it, I would rather have us be at the forefront of entrepreneurship, of academia, of troublemaking, of whatever field of the law. I want more Sotomayors. I want many other things in this world. But I also want to be able to call a good contractor and say, mira, necesito que me hagan el techo, right? Like, I need somebody to do my roof, and I want to trust my own people to do that. And I know that it's going to be the best, and that I am going to help financially my community to lift itself by sharing my resources. And so however you pull people to you, pull it with pride, pull it with Latinidad. And you'll create the equity in this world you are dreaming to see and you're fighting to create every day.
You hit a chord. My father was the best roofer in the world. I'm very proud of the person I ever knew. But yeah, I mean, that's my experience. Latinos are hardworking and optimistic about the future.
Wow, I am just so grateful. I want to thank all of our amazing panelists for this thoughtful discussion, your generosity of sharing your life story. Thank you so much, Lisbeth Melendez Rivera, Mariana Mazzini, Ruben Barreles, and Diana Mulagon. Thank you all. Please keep tweeting about the conference at hashtag CHCIHHM21. We have a full slate of sessions scheduled for today, including the CICH pitch competition this evening at 4:45 Eastern Standard. If you know people who'd be interested in the conference but haven't signed up, encourage them to log in and register at chci.org. And also, please join our virtual 44th Annual Awards Gala celebration on Thursday evening, September 23rd, from 6:30 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I always like to end with a beautiful poem. It's called En Lakesh, You Are My Other Me by Luis Valdez, a Maya-inspired poem, 1973. And it says, Tú eres mi otro yo, si te hago daño a ti, me hago daño a mí mismo. Si te amo y respeto, me amo y respeto yo. You are my other me. If I do harm to you, I do harm to myself. If I love and respect you, I love and respect myself. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for doing all the work that you do to advance equity and leadership in our communities. And I am so grateful to have you all here, and I hope that we one day will be able to talk in person. Thank you again, and best wishes to you and yours. Saludos, familia.